I'm very honored to be here among you today, and I would also like to thank all of you for coming out this afternoon and showing an interest in water rights and development. I've had the opportunity to do some research and teaching on water rights, and it truly is the biggest human rights issue in the world today. And I say that because there are about 800 million people today, as we sit here, who have no clean water. And there's another 1.5 billion people that have no adequate sanitation. So when we look at water, we don't just look at clean water, we also look at sanitation, because the two go hand in hand. As you can imagine, a lot of times a watershed or a stream or a river will be polluted by human waste, by sewage, by contaminants, by chemicals. And when that happens, the water supply gets contaminated. And then you have a situation where people are going to get sick. Because as Geshe-la Ladora was saying, water is fundamental to human life. And we need to recognize that preserving the purity and the integrity of our water supply is absolutely essential. So I really appreciate the fact that you've come here this afternoon, and it's important that we learn together. All of you have great ideas, you have your own observations, and you have intelligent points of view. It's really important to hear that today. So the PowerPoint that's been prepared will talk about some of these major issues, and then the second part, which personally is more important, is to hear what you have to say. So please don't be shy. Feel free to make your comments or to ask questions. And then at the end of the day, we can really learn together and hopefully share with our friends, with our family, with our colleagues, our knowledge and our compassion about providing clean water for people not only in Dharamsala and in Tibet, but really share our concerns with people around the world. And one of the great things about the age that we live in today is that we are so media connected through Facebook, through internet, through Twitter, through television. We can reach literally millions of people. And if you're involved in a human rights action, human rights for Tibet, human rights for water, the media give us a wonderful opportunity to promote a message that can reach very, very far. So let's start out with this PowerPoint, and after that we'll take a chance to hear what you have to say, and please feel free to ask any questions that you have. So I'll just talk about some of the slides, not all of them, but basically if you look at the world today, about 2% of the total water for the entire planet is fresh water. 98% is salt water, and it's not drinkable. The problem with salt water is that desalination is a process that is extremely expensive. So one day I hope that great minds will create a technology to allow us to take the salt out of the salt water. When that day happens, that will be one of the greatest achievements of humankind. But until that happens, desalination is very, very expensive, and for most developing countries, it's not even possible because they don't even have the money for basic services like healthcare, education, roads, and schools. So for now, we really have to rely on working with the 2% of the water in the world that is fresh. However, of that 2%, half of that water is not usable because it's polluted. It's polluted by sewage, chemicals, contamination, and it's also depleted by evaporation, by the natural cycles of weather. So what we're really talking about today, only 1% of global water is fresh, and that is an enormous challenge for all of us. And here's something else to think about. Does anybody know the global population today in 2014? Yeah. 7 point, okay. So around 7.6, 7.5. The United Nations estimates that by the year 2050, global population will reach 9 billion people. So the question therefore becomes, how do we provide water for those extra 1.5 billion people when we already do not have water for 800 million people in the world today? So again, this is one of the greatest humanitarian challenges of our age. And it's a challenge that all of us, I think, can take a responsibility in trying to educate about and perhaps even working on through efforts in government, human rights, development, economic development. But certainly that's going to be a major issue that we have to deal with, providing more water for the additional 1.5 billion people that will be here within 36 years. I mean, when you're a little bit older like we are, we know how fast time goes. 36 years will be here before we know it, and that's going to be a great opportunity for us to show our compassion, our leadership, our human rights dedication on the issue of water. Now, let me just continue here. There's a common rule if you study economics and government and human rights. It's called the 80-20 rule. Basically, the 80-20 rule says that 80% of global wealth is controlled by 20% of the population. It's nothing new. I mean, we've had oligarchs and concentration of wealth and greed for centuries. Even Buddha is on record as condemning the caste system in India, because as you all know, the caste system relegates 160 million people today in India to utter poverty and degradation and living really below the poverty line. So poverty and greed have been with us, unfortunately, since human history began. Today, though, this rule holds true, that we have about 20% of the population controlling 80% of the wealth. And when you look at the developing world, you see hundreds of millions of people without the basic requirements for life: water, food, education, schools, roads, medicine. So it's a really big challenge that all of us face. And again, as the population increases, the number of people that are living at the margins of society will increase. Now, there's a formula that the United Nations and the economic bodies use to determine the poverty line. So the international poverty line is classified as $1.25 per day. So $1.25 a day in US dollars would be about 80 or 90 rupees. So if somebody's living below, let's take the Indian context, or here in Dharamsala, if somebody's living below about 80 or 90 rupees per day, they're considered living below the poverty line. Now, Milton Friedman, has anybody heard of Milton Friedman? Okay. Tell me what you know about Milton Friedman.
He won the Nobel Prize for Economics, and he teaches in Borne University.
That's good, yeah. Back in Vancouver, Milton Friedman came to do a speech at a think tank. And I'm not a big fan of Milton Friedman for some things, but for other things, I think he did good work. But he came to this conference, and he's been an advisor, as your colleague pointed out, to the Indian government and the American government and many, many governments, and considered a very, very respected economist. So I had the chance to interview Milton Friedman, and you would think that he would be concerned about inflation and price curves and demand curves and these sort of economic issues, supply and demand. So the question was put to Dr. Friedman. What is the biggest economic crisis in the world today? Now, what kind of an answer do you think, being a right-wing economist, very pro-business, anybody have an idea what answer he gave to the question of what is the biggest economic crisis in the world today? Sorry? Yeah. I was trying to stand in front of the slide, but I'm not that big. Well, it was surprising because one would think that he would talk about demand curves and inflation and inflationary spirals, you know, the typical jargon of an economist. That was his answer, which shows that even a right-wing economist who's rooted in the business world can develop a consciousness for the poor and the dispossessed. And it was interesting because Milton Friedman, he was about 82 when we had this interview. Very short man, but what he lacked in size, he made up in energy. He was a tremendously energetic man. He played tennis every day. But his answer was surprising because it showed that even a right-wing economist can develop a consciousness for the poor, which is clearly what he did before he died. Now, some of you may have heard of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's CRC 1989. This is a very important human rights document because for the first time in history, the international community developed a convention specifically designed to protect the rights of children. And as you all know, many, many children in the developing world are very vulnerable. Their rights are not protected. They don't receive adequate food. They don't receive adequate health care. They don't receive adequate medicine. And a lot of the literature coming out today, medical and health literature, shows that the child is not fully developed until adulthood. In other words, a human being is not fully developed in their body and then their brain until about the age of 20 or 21. Previous research had thought that it was earlier, maybe 17 or 18, but the new research coming out of leading institutions is conclusively showing that the human being is not fully developed until about 20 or 21, depending on the person, and also your environment. Which means that the child is particularly vulnerable to disease, infection, poverty, lack of food, lack of nutrition. And when that child is living in a poverty-stricken environment, then the vulnerabilities of that child increase dramatically. So it's very important that the world community came together in 1989, developed the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and enumerated several articles that basically promote and protect the rights of the child. Now, if any of you are interested in human rights or international law, one of the realities that you come to grips with is that just because you have a human rights treaty and just because you have international law, it doesn't mean that it will be followed. So there's a gap between international law and enforcement. Think of a beautiful bird. You have many beautiful birds here in Dharamsala. If one wing of the bird is weak and the other wing of the bird is strong, the bird won't fly. It'll go in circles in a very clumsy way. It's the same thing with international law. We need strong laws, but we also need strong enforcement. When both wings are strong, the bird of human rights, the bird of child rights can fly and literally soar. So this is one of the great challenges because many countries have signed international treaties like the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And on paper, they're committed to following it. But the reality is that on the ground, very little effort is taken because of many reasons. It could be corruption. It could be poverty. It could be because the victims are marginalized people, and often marginalized people like the untouchables in India don't get the attention that they deserve and that they need. So international law is very important, as we all understand, but we really need to focus as people, as governments, and as an international community at the UN level on making sure that enforcement is occurring on a day-to-day basis. I think if you look at Article 6 of the CRC right here, you can see that it is very closely related to water rights. Because water, as you know, is closely related to survival and development. So I think there's a good linkage between Article 6 of CRC 1989 and survival and development in a healthy way. Can everybody see this at the back here? It's good? Okay. A major milestone for human rights was in July 2010 when the United Nations declared water is a human right. So even though everybody would say that that's obvious, that that's just common sense, the fact is it was never actually codified and recognized internationally. So once the UN made this dramatic statement, then the international community focused more attention on water as a human right. So this is a major milestone in terms of the human rights literature around water. Now, the United Nations has a set of Millennium Development Goals that are due in 2015 to be accomplished. As you can see, one of the major goals around water was to cut by 50% the number of people that do not have access to clean water. So the United Nations is making good progress on this goal. It's due next year, but the target will not be met. The target on sanitation, though, they're much more successful in terms of getting proper sanitation to the developing world, because as you can imagine, without proper sanitation, there's a risk of disease, illness, contaminated water supply. So it's very important, as pointed out at the beginning, that water and sanitation rights and development go hand in hand. So these are some basic rights that we look at when examining the whole issue of water. The right to water for survival is pretty obvious. The right to clean drinking water. The right to water for sanitation and health. And the right to water for an adequate standard of living. Because if an environment lacks basic clean water, development, health, human rights are all going to be affected dramatically. So it's very important to make sure that water is part of the community and also the larger community. One of the major issues that comes up around water rights is what we call waterborne disease. So waterborne disease can include parasites like schistosomiosis. It can include guinea worm that people get when they go into the water and they have an open cut. And these little worms actually get inside the body of the person, and then they grow. And they grow and grow and cause physical suffering and infection and disease. So guinea worm has been a major problem, for instance, in parts of Africa. The other major problem is diarrhea. And even though diarrhea is relatively simple to treat, in a developing country where there's severe poverty and a person is living in the village level, they might not have the medicine to treat the diarrhea. Now, somebody here in Dharamsala who gets diarrhea can easily go to the medical dispensary You can buy some tablets or Pepto-Bismol, and within a day or two, you're back to normal. One of the reasons that you can get back to normal so quickly is that you have clean water to drink, so that you can rehydrate on a daily basis. But ask yourself the question, what would a person in a village who's suffering extreme poverty do if there was no clean water in the environment? So the child has diarrhea, they need water to rehydrate, but every hour they're losing more water. The nearest water hole might be 2 kilometers away. The mother, the father, the sister might have to walk 2 kilometers to collect some water. But what happens if the water that they collect is contaminated? What would you do in that situation? Anybody have a suggestion? If the water you get to help treat your child who has diarrhea is contaminated, what are you going to do with that water? Yeah, okay. So what do you need to boil the water? Fire? You need, yeah? Yeah, you need some accelerant. There are pictures, for example, in Africa of entire plains, entire valleys. All the wood has been stripped. It's gone. So if you're able to find some water and you bring it back to your hut, you must boil the water. But if you have no fire, you have no gasoline, of course, because there would not be gasoline in the village. If you have no accelerant, you literally cannot boil the water. And this is the case that happens millions of times. The child is given water that's not clean, and maybe the family doesn't even know, they don't even understand. Because you need to be educated to understand things like parasites, guinea worm, schistosomiosis, boiling, killing infection. You need to be a little bit educated to understand that. If you're not and you're poor, you give the child dirty water. And that's why so many children die of diarrhea. A disease or a condition that is so easily treated in places like Dharamsala, Vancouver, New York, and London. I mean, so this is, again, a big challenge that we face. So quickly, with waterborne disease, I just wanted you to have a look at this slide because it just gives you an idea of how easy it is to catch a waterborne disease. And then, of course, the treatment will depend on your standard of living and your income and the access to health care. Now, these are some of the obstacles to clean water. Obviously, poverty, as we discussed, lack of environmental awareness, industrial pollution, and deforestation. There have been studies done by the United Nations that the average person in the developing world has to walk 6 kilometers a day to go and get water. Now, if that person is themselves suffering from an illness like malaria or guinea worm, it's going to make their journey even more difficult. The other reality is that 80% of the water carriers, and this is from a study done by the United Nations, 80% of water carriers in the developing world are women and girls. And what often happens is when the women and the girls go out to get the water, early in the morning or in the late afternoon, they're also vulnerable to attack, to assault. So this is another whole dimension of the vulnerability that marginalized, poverty-stricken women and girls have to deal with on a day-to-day basis in the developing world. So it's not simply a matter of going out and collecting the water, as difficult as that may be, but it's also a question of protecting the safety of the girl or the woman. So I think we're going to about, is it 4:30? Okay, so I just finish up another 10 minutes and then we'll get into the question and answer and comment section. So I wanted to talk about India because that's a country that we're all very familiar with, and of course here we are in India. So let's look at some of the facts around India. You can see a high percentage of Indian citizens are affected by waterborne disease every year. And the consequences of this are very severe, because if a person is suffering from a waterborne disease, they're not able to work, they're not able to go to school, there's a loss of family income if they're a provider. If they're a child in the family that normally helps with chores, they're not able to do those chores. If the family has to go out and get medicine, then the cost of that medicine will not allow them to spend that money on other things that may be important for the family, like food or shelter. So the costs associated with waterborne disease, if you look around the world, really run into the trillions of dollars. So it's not simply a matter of treating the disease, it's treating all the other issues that come up because a person is suffering from a waterborne disease. Now, India alone, economists calculate, has a $600 million cost every year just from unsafe water. And as you know, India is a developing country, a rapidly developing country, but that $600 million is money that could be better spent on other important areas of society, like healthcare, schools, hospitals, medicine, and so forth. Now, this is an interesting statistic because, again, many studies have been done by the United Nations and the NGO community, and they find that women and girls are very reluctant to go to school if they don't have proper toilet and sanitation facilities. And it's enough of an issue that will prevent a lot of these girls from even going to school. So then you're not only dealing with health and sanitation issues, but then the child, the girl child, is going to be at a disadvantage in terms of education. So you can see this is a good example of some of the consequences of water. It's not just about water and health, but there are many, many consequences that come up when there's no clean water or good sanitation facilities in the environment. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about Mali. Mali in Africa is one of the poorest countries in the world. To give you an example, the average person in Mali uses 8 liters of water a day. So 8 liters of water would be for washing, cleaning, drinking, everything. The average person in the United States of America uses 300 liters of water per day. So you can see the gap, if you will, the development gap. 8 liters of water a day in Mali. 300 liters a day of water in the United States of America. And most Americans, and I would include Canadians as well, are water wasters. The waste of water in North America and in Europe is shameful. You know, people will wash their car when they don't need to. They'll take 5 showers a day. They waste their water, and yet water, if you look at Mali, is so precious. Now, you might ask the question, how much water does the average person need for basic survival? There's a very well-known, respected water scientist named Peter Glick. And Peter Glick did a basic water supply chart. And he calculated that the average person's basic water requirement is 50 liters per day. So clearly, if somebody in Mali is getting 8 liters of water per day, they're dramatically below the basic water requirement to sustain adequate, healthy living. And you know, when we talked earlier about the 80-20 rule. This is a good example. Water is a precious commodity, but many people in the world cannot share it, cannot access it. Other people in the world are living in water-rich countries where they can waste water and it doesn't matter. It's one of the development gaps that's very unfortunate, but it's a reality of international development. This is an interesting picture here. What these children are doing in Mali is they're using a straw. It's a very simple device, but it can be very effective. What happens, the straw has a tiny filter inside. And when they suck the water here, and this is not clean water, but the filter in the straw filters out parasites and contaminants. So the child or the adult gets water. Maybe they only get 5 or 6 ounces of water, but it's still better than getting 5 or 6 ounces of contaminated water. So it's interesting that you don't always have to think big or spend big money to solve human development problems. This simple straw can actually save hundreds of thousands of lives and millions of days of sickness, because if they're using the straw, they're likely not going to get a waterborne disease, not going to get diarrhea, not going to get schizomyces. So this is a small but very beautiful invention that is, as I said, saving lives. Now let's talk about Tibet. Tibet is a country that's in your hearts, it's in your soul, it's in your thoughts every day. For me, coming to Dharamsala, it's a real honor to be with you, because the Tibetan people, being here for 3 weeks is not a long time, but it's long enough to know. It's long enough to know that the Tibetan people are brave, they're compassionate, and they're very courageous people. Tibet also faces right now, in addition to the human rights crisis that you're all aware of, Tibet is facing a very severe threat to its water supply. They talk about 3 poles in the world. Does anybody know what the 3 poles are? And the third one? Thank you. You can all help me out with this seminar because you all know a lot. You're right. And Tibet is one of the, not only endowed with a great historic sacred culture, Tibet is endowed with water richness. The Tibet Plateau feeds so many countries in the world who depend on Tibet. Sadly, the Tibet Plateau has been taken over, and it's being exploited. You can use any language you want, but the bottom line, we like to say in North America, the bottom line is that the Tibet Plateau is being terribly exploited. And that's not just a shame for the immediate region, but it's a shame for many, many countries. So let's take a look at some of the information around Tibet. The Tibet Plateau has 46,000 glaciers. 3rd largest ice mass in the entire world. And if you look at the bottom here, I don't know if you can see it at the back, but I'll read the third one. This is very profound. Tibet is the fountain of the Yangtze, Yellow, Indus, Ganges, Brahmaputra, Chenab, Sutlej, Salween, and Mekong, which flow through 11 nations. So you've got 11 nations whose water livelihood, whose health, whose development is tied up with Tibet and the Tibet Plateau. It's quite remarkable. So these are some of the major issues that Tibet is facing. Climate change. We have obviously China's encroachment upon the Tibet Plateau. And we have a lack of infrastructure for the Tibetan people. So their ability to get water has been severely compromised. I mean, you look at these women here, or men, each one of those drums probably weighs about 50 to 60 pounds. Plus, you're carrying that weight uphill, and the person might not be young and vigorous. Some of these people here look a little bit older. Carrying water is very demanding and physically punishing. And that's why we say that the infrastructure is not strong to be providing this abundant water to the Tibetan people when they deserve it, because it is their water. Now, this is a concern. You've all studied and read and heard about climate change and global warming. But look at this issue with respect to Tibet. The glacier in Tibet is melting at a rate 3 times the rate at the North and the South Pole. So obviously global warming is a serious environmental, health, human rights threat to the Tibetan people. The second point, scientists, and their calculations tend to be fairly accurate, but scientists are warning that most of Tibet's glaciers, and remember there are 46,000 glaciers on the Tibet Plateau, scientists are warning that most of those glaciers could vanish by 2035. That's only 21 years from today, if carbon gas emissions are not reduced. The problem is, has anybody seen a picture of Beijing recently? It's frightening. You can't even see buildings. It's like a gray cloud descended over Beijing. And warming up the country and affecting the plateau. So it's a major concern. Now, you all know the history since 1949. It's very clear that the Chinese Communist government is willing to suspend reality, willing to suspend human rights, willing to suspend their conscience so that they can control the Tibet Plateau and the Tibet water. It's simply about power and control and using those resources not in a development way, but in a narrow, self-interested way. Look at the second point. China has built more dams in the past 5 years, decades rather, the past 5 decades, than the rest of the world combined. So there's a rapid acceleration program here to control and consolidate the water resources of the Tibet Plateau. Now, this statement is from an official with the Tibetan government in exile, right here at this beautiful compound. And for those of you at the back that may not be able to see it, I'll just read the statement. Quote, China's action in the Tibetan Plateau can seriously decrease the water supplies of India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and Burma, as well as the Yangtze River Basin, as far as Shanghai, especially in drought years. Meanwhile, rural Tibetans, the ones that are the most impoverished, suffer high rates of hepatitis, waterborne infections, and back pain due to inadequate village water supplies. A very accurate statement from one of your officials in the CTA here in Dharamsala. Now again, going back to the water carriers, the United Nations, if you're interested in this topic, I always tell audiences and students it's a great subject for a seminar, a presentation, or an essay, or a master's thesis, but water carriers are predominantly women and girls. And if you look at these young ladies here, you can see that this weight is quite heavy. And the average water carrier marches 6 kilometers per day. So this is a serious physical hardship, as well as the health and medical issues around unclean water. Now, this is the academic, the water scientist that I referred to earlier, Peter Glick. And basically what Peter is saying in this slide is that what happens in Tibet doesn't just affect China or the Tibetans. And there's very little public discussion about the Tibetan Plateau. And there's very little discussion about the international and human rights consequences of China controlling the Tibetan Plateau. So it's not just a Chinese issue of coercion. It's an issue of water rights for over 1 billion people that depend on the Tibetan Plateau. Now, I think that it's a fitting place to conclude the presentation with the words of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. And just for, again, this might be a little bit difficult to read, so I'll just take the opportunity to read it for you. His Holiness said, however the tea is prepared, the primary ingredient is always water. While we can live without tea, we cannot live without water. Likewise, we are born free of religion, but we are not born free of the need for compassion. So on that point, by His Holiness, I'd like to thank you very, very much for being here today and sharing your concerns about water rights and development. And the most interesting part is your thoughts, your questions, so please feel free to contribute. Thank you.
In 2012, there was huge pressure on the United Nations to change the wording from access to clean water, from human right to clean water to access to clean water. How is that going now? Because there were outcries from human rights groups all over the world during that section of time.
Yeah.
Access to clean water, of course, means that you can buy it from companies.
Yeah. That's a very good question. The saying that there's a human right to water is not going far enough. What you need to do is guarantee an access to water, which is a far different story. And there's a big concern, as you pointed out, about the privatization of water. More and more we're saying impoverished, marginalized people having to pay for even minimal amounts of water. So I think your point is well taken. We need to do more work on enshrining access issues, because just saying that water is a human right is not enough. And obviously it's not enough when you look at 800 million people in the world have no clean water in their environment.
My question is about international law, and I hope to study international law at some point in time. So you mentioned that there's no enforcement of international law, although the codification of the treaty obligations and various other aspects of creating such treaties is pretty good. But what are your views on ensuring that enforcement? Because that's one of the biggest problems of maybe our times in the international world.
Well, that's a very, very intelligent question, and I thank you for sharing it. I did a doctoral thesis on human rights and children, and the major question I examined was what I called the enforcement gap. So there is an enforcement gap when it comes to human rights. Some of the most repressive countries in the world have the most liberal sounding constitutions. What matters is the reality on the ground. We use that expression in the West, reality on the ground. What can we do? Pressure. A lot of governments today are dealing with pressure that they didn't have to deal with 50 years ago. Why? Because youth today, your generation, are truly going to be the generation that ignites the world in a profound way, not a small way. Your generation is going to make profound changes. Why, in my view? Because of social media, internet, Twitter, cell phones, documentary films, television programs. Governments that are repressive hate publicity. And one of the ways I think can be effective is to shame governments into doing what is right. You know, in my own work, I've interviewed many, many political prisoners. And they will often say that letters from Amnesty International, letters from Human Rights Watch, prevented their jailers, their oppressors, from being more severe with them, because they knew that they were being watched. And there's an old wisdom from the philosopher Aristotle that many of you have studied, one of the great minds of science and politics and government. And Aristotle said that people obey the law not because they may be more virtuous. Although if he were talking about Tibetans, they would be more virtuous. But he was talking in general, people obey the law because they're afraid of getting caught. So I will use that analogy to talk about governments. When governments know they're under the spotlight, they tend to behave better. And the other interesting point is that any treaty at the United Nations, whether it's a treaty or a convention, has a reporting mechanism. So governments are required to submit a very detailed factual report to the United Nations treaty body. So for example, the Convention on the Rights of the Child has a treaty body that will collect all these reports from every signatory of the CRC. And they will bring those representatives of the government before the panel at the United Nations and question them. What progress are you making, for example, on this torture convention or on the Convention on the Rights of the Child? And all these proceedings are public documents. They're available to anybody around the world. Those procedures have often pushed governments to do what is more responsible. The other thing I think is important is to keep pushing international law. It's not perfect, but we need more international law. We need more people like you dedicating your career to it. We need more publicity. And collectively, if these efforts continue, we can make more progress than we've made in the past. I think there was a question at the back, yes?
Okay, I have two questions regarding your talk. The first is regarding the children in Mali using the straws. So I wanted to know what was the incentive that was given to Malians to use such a device, which is against their traditional ways.
Yeah.
And my second question is regarding Dharamshala itself. So there's been a remarkable spike in tourism since 2007 here, after the Indian Premier League started. So how do you handle a tourist pressure, an uneducated tourist pressure with waste and pollution caused by that waste in the water bodies here? So
Good questions. Well, let me start with Mali. Often, poverty is a function of the technology and the development. So obviously Mali is a very poor country, one of the poorest countries in the world. Their ability to even purchase technology is severely limited. So people got creative, thinking about holistic, simple techniques that could actually make a big difference. And research was done on these filter systems. And they concluded that the filter could be put into a tiny straw device, very cheap to make, easy to distribute, easy to carry, because I don't know, I haven't held one, but it probably weighs about 4 or 5 ounces. So the solution for Mali, and it's being used in many other countries in Africa, was that we couldn't afford a high-tech solution. But we could afford a low-tech solution that was very, very effective. And the bottom line, it works. Now, with respect to Dharamsala, you're right, there's many, many tourists coming here. They put a strain on the water supply. They put a strain on the roads. I suppose you welcome tourists because it also gives you an opportunity to promote your culture, your beautiful culture, and promote Buddhism and the cause of the Dalai Lama. But the fact is that tourism does leave an imprint on your society here, and it draws away perhaps resources that may be more needed. There was an opportunity during my visit to go and visit Nagawan at LHA Law, the charitable trust. And as you may know, they have a clean water project. And currently they provide a water filtration system that was actually produced in India. The technology is from India. And they've now installed this water filter purification system in 30 schools in and around Dharamshala. So it's a very exciting development. So you'll always have tourism to Dharamsala. And I suppose part of your message around the world is supported by having tourists come to Dharamshala. But at the same time, you still have to look at the quality of life for the people that are living here. Hopefully, tourists that come here have enough social conscience to say, it's a good idea to contribute to this school, it's a good idea to contribute to the Clean Water Project, and it's a good idea to come here and be a responsible citizen. Hopefully that'll be the case. Yeah. Question? I don't know who was first. Ladies first?
Okay, I just want to ask the question regarding, for example, I will set my own example. What happened is that in Dharamsala, although we are talking a lot about water, but we have a problem regarding the water. For example, what I do is that in my home, I have lots of buckets. So I fill the buckets with water and keep it for a week.
Yeah.
So when a week passes, I feel like, it's not safe to use these waters. So I just throw them out, So, but at the same time, there's a sense of it. There's a feeling of guilt that you are doing these kinds of things. So how long can a person keep the water in one's home in a bucket, say, for a week or two, especially when that water is to prepare a meal or things like that? And that's my first question. And my second question is regarding many a times, what I feel is that even though we have enough water here, but whenever we are using these abundant amount of waters, we always have this feeling that in remote corners of the world, people are deprived of these important things. But then how could one able to help? I'm speaking this in the context where you said that in Canada or America, where people are using 50 or 300 liters of water. But how could one can't able to transport these waters into Africa or say countries like that? So how could able to one cope with these kinds of situations?
Well, thank you for sharing those points. Let me go to your first point, because there are very inexpensive water purification tablets that you can put into water to kill parasites and bacteria, and they can be very, very effective. They're very affordable for most people in the world. However, because of the severe poverty in countries like Mali, they're not readily available in those countries. They would be if more governments and NGOs and individuals stepped up, because they're relatively cheap. But again, when you're talking about severe poverty, even a water purification tablet is difficult to afford. But for here, like your specific point about your tank, that might be something to invest in. Water purification tablets. Do some research. And also share it with the people in Dharamshala. Share it with your friends. Share it with your family. You have some wonderful newsletters in Dharamshala, and they accept letters and little articles. LHA, the charitable trust, has a wonderful newsletter. Share it with other people, because so many people are not aware of these great ideas. The other point I want to mention is there's something called water tapping. Water tapping is a brilliant idea where you can assemble a water trap system, for example, on your roof, like a trough. It'll capture the water and allow the water to run off into like a barrel. You put the water purification tablets in the barrel. And you can keep that water for weeks. Water tapping is actually being used very extensively in rural India. Many villages are now adopting water tapping as a progressive, clean, and environmentally safe method of capturing water. So there are some wonderful progressive solutions out there for capturing water. You could be the first one in Dharamshala to do water tapping, and you would be deservedly so a local hero. Now, as to your second point, you know, the West has a lot to learn about environmental integrity, because the waste of water in the West is just shameful. You know, there's a list of water-rich countries in the world: Canada, Norway, Iceland, obviously. And, you know, often these countries, it's not that they're unkind people, it's just that they're privileged. And because the water is so abundant, they just don't appreciate it. All we can do is try to encourage the water-rich nations to have a conscience to help those that are water poor, and those governments like Canada to contribute more to development projects, you know, in countries like Mali and Ethiopia and so forth. Yes?
Okay, I have two questions.
Sure.
First one is, as you were talking about one technology which is quite expensive, so the salt water, you can use it for drinking or something you were mentioning. Desalinization or something you were saying, which is quite expensive. So I was thinking, is it already invented or is under process? Or if it's under process, when we can expect that? And the other question is, a few days back, I think last month, in Times of India newspaper, I read a small article that if you take a dip in Ganga river, it causes cancer. So I was wondering what kind of cancer and what causes cancer. So you can throw some light if you have some idea on that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, the first point is that, you know, when we look at technology, desalinization is available, but on a very, very small scale. So it's very capital intensive. In order to provide enough desalination to provide for even a small community like 50,000 people would cost millions of dollars. So the question you would immediately have is who can afford it? Well, the Canadians don't need it. The Irish don't need it. The Norwegians certainly don't need it. Who needs it? Mali, Ethiopia, parts of Egypt, and yet they're developing countries. And one of the sad ironies, and we don't understand why these conditions happen, but one of the sad ironies of life and development is that poor nations are primarily in the southern hemisphere, where water crisis is most severe. And that's just a reality of nature and in the environment that we don't have any control over. So to answer your question, desalination is available, but it's so capital and cost intensive that it will not be a solution for very many people. And certainly the poor developing countries cannot afford it. So that's sort of the dilemma that we're in right now. Now, with respect to cancer, I'm not a medical doctor, but I've had a chance to, this conference, I urge all of you to look at, if you check our website, I'll put it up again. So we have a website, and we talk about this conference. There was a United Nations conference in Toronto in November of 2013. And the UN and the Institute for Water, Environment and Health, INWEH, have this remarkable program called WASH, W-A-S-H. So WASH stands for Water and Sanitation Hygiene. Water and Sanitation Hygiene, WASH. It's a great name. And if you look at our website here, www.globalwaterrights.com, I brought some cards. If any of you are interested, I can give you a card. We talk about this conference, and it was very exciting to meet people from all over the world at this conference doing amazing work on human rights. We had medical doctors, we had NGO leaders, UN people, and so forth. And one of the things that we learned is that cancer is environmental. So cancer is not just symptomatic of one or two events. It's symptomatic of multiple carcinogens in your environment. And water in many parts of the world is contaminated by arsenic, by lead, by metals, by parasites, by toxins. They contribute to cancer. So that's why we need to work very diligently to promote the integrity, the cleanliness, the health of the water supply. Because water is not just about your immediate health, but it has long-term consequences on the community, on your region, and ultimately on your nation as well. Yes, we have...
Hello, Dr. Ross. I have a small suggestion. It's like we are implementing, you are saying there are international laws and everything, but when we see, like, we have to reach to the ground level. So I just think that when I was a kid, when I was in the school, so nobody taught me that we have to save water and that, this, not even the teacher, not the parents, you know. So I just think we have to reach ground level, you know, like to the grassroots levels. We have to go to the school, reach out to the students, kids, and we have to, you know, do whatever. We have to show skits or everything, so we can, you know, save water. Like in the future, we don't face any problems. So regarding the Ganga thing, I just saw a small documentary on the Ganga River in Discovery Channel. So they were saying when you drink water of Ganga, the water itself has a power or something. It doesn't cause any disease. So instead it cures disease. I saw that, but I don't know. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that, and I want to tell you that there's a woman that works for the United Nations University. There's 12 United Nations universities around the world. They're called UNU, and Canada is lucky to have one of them at McMaster University, which is very close to Toronto. So at this conference, Dr. Corinne Schuster-Wallace was there, and she is a UN university official, and she does a lot of research on water rights and development. She would be very proud of what you just said, because at this conference, Corinne made a very passionate statement that we need more education. It's good to have projects, it's good to fund medical research, but she said, more importantly, we need education. We need to tell our family, our friends, our colleagues. So what you're saying is absolutely right. Talk to people. Talk to people, share the issue, and that's really how things progress. Communication. We are social beings. We all need to communicate. We all need to be connected with one another. And this is a great issue to be connected with people on. If you look at our website, we have a section called Individual Partner, IP. We have students like you, we have young people, we have all kinds of people joining us as what we call individual partners. So what is an individual partner? It's somebody that simply works in your own community to promote the message of water rights. You could be doing Facebook, you could be talking to friends, you could be on Twitter. If you want to do a presentation, I will send this presentation to you. And you can use it in a classroom, you can use it for a seminar in your university, you can use it with a club that you might be involved in. And I can talk to you via Skype or phone or email and give you some suggestions. But if you want to get involved, it's not a lot of work. But it's very rewarding because you can be a communicator. So again, if any of you are interested in joining us as an individual partner, there's no cost involved, just a little bit of your heart, which is more valuable. Please check our website, and if you wish to pursue it, send me an email and I'd be happy to talk to you by Skype or phone you, or we can do email. And we would be honored to have more people join us as individual partners from Dharamshala.
Last question. Thank you.
Thank you.
For giving this chance for last question. Actually, this is not a question, but it's my view or suggestion. For me, when I was in school or childhood, I really know at that time, the teacher giving advice. Right now, the water is very scarcity because of the global warming or some other cases. So we all know that, and when the teacher is teaching in the class, and the water is very important right now. So we all know this. But in practically, for me and all of us, we know that water is very scarce right now in this world. So, but I think the main problem is each of the person, they didn't take a responsibility for the water. Because of the, right now, we know professor showing the data, all of the mentioned in the presentations. So what people we can do right now? How can we preserve the water in this world? So thank you. This is my suggestions or view.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. And just talk to people. There's a famous anthropologist named Margaret Mead. She passed away years ago, but she lived to what we call a ripe old age. And she was a pioneer in anthropology. And somebody once said to Margaret Mead when she was a young woman, she was full of ambition, well, what are you going to do? You're just one person. You're not going to change the world. I love what Margaret Mead said, because Margaret Mead said something that all of us should put in our heart and remember. She said, the only thing that ever changed the world is one person. The Dalai Lama, Gandhi, Wendell Phillips, Martin Luther King Jr. People said they would make no difference. They changed the world. So that's what Margaret Mead's message was. You can do the same. You don't need a big office. You don't need a big budget. You just need a big heart. And you can make things happen. And I go back to the point earlier, communicate. Talk to friends and family. And if they say, well, you told me that before, say, yes, but I'm telling you again. I'm reminding you. Join a club, make a talk at your university. And I wanted to close with a quote that's one of my favorite quotes. It goes back to the time of Cicero, the great Roman, and he was an orator. He said, if you take a pebble or a small rock and drop it into the mid-ocean, it'll give rise to waves that reach the farthest shore. The ripples will go far. And so it is with the actions of good people. A good deed ripples far. And you won't know how far it goes. But it's also wonderful karma. Good deeds, as Geshe-la Lador told us yesterday, good deeds, action, reaction, they create good karma. So that would be something that is important to think about. What you do can ripple far and wide. So don't ever think, I'm just one person. You're much bigger. So thank you for your attention and your commitment and your passion for this topic. And I just, in closing, would like to say best of wishes, best of luck with your translation course. Although I have it on good authority that you have one of the best teachers in Asia guiding you. So there's no doubt that you will be successful in your course because you've got a great teacher to guide you. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Although I know there are many people who are trying to ask more questions and hold you here the whole night. But because of short of time, and we are closing. But the purpose of such a talk is not to simply entertain you, but to keep something in your mind and to practice it in your daily life. Very often the example that many Westerners and others put and that almost tries to discourage us is that, oh, we can't do anything. When the giant wheel moves, then the cog has to move. The helpless cog has to move. But my observation is, if the cog in the wheel doesn't cooperate, the wheel might stop. So we all have a responsibility, big responsibility, and don't forget that responsibility, not only in preservation of water, but any good human endeavor. Thank you very much for reminding this.
Thank you.